two lines on the same passenger manifest. Both entries record a woman traveling to New York in April of 1912. Both women were employed to look after somebody else's clothes, children, and rooms. One line records a fare of 13 pounds. The other records 247 pounds, 10 shillings and sixpence. Neither woman chose her fare. A clerk chose it, months earlier, from a schedule of rates. That schedule is the subject here, because on one night, it decided which of them would be alive in the morning. Subscribe if this is the kind of history worth an evening. The 13-pound entry belongs to Amelia Mary Brown, aged 18, cook to a Montreal family named Allison, ticket number 248733, boarding at Southampton, second class. The larger entry belongs to Rosalie Bidouin, aged 46, personal maid to the second Mrs. Astor, boarding at Cherbourg, first class. Bidouin traveled on the Astor party ticket at more than 19 times the cook's fare. Both women were servants. Both had employers aboard. Only one of them was ever in the same part of the ship as the people who paid her. The gap between those two lines was not an accident of booking. It was the household itself, written out as money. A great fortune in 1912 did not simply own property. It ran a staff. A Fifth Avenue house, a Philadelphia estate, a Montreal mansion. Each of these worked as a small institution, with ranks, sleeping quarters graded by seniority, service corridors, and a covered door between the rooms where money was spent and the rooms where it was serviced. Above that door the family lived. Behind it, the household worked. A lady's maid was not a cleaner. She managed a wardrobe that changed several times a day, and each change had to be pressed, aired, mended, and remembered. She dressed her mistress and undressed her. She handled the jewelry, the hair, the medicines, and the letters. A valet did the equivalent for a man. He shaved him, laid out his evening clothes, packed and unpacked, and kept the shoes and coats in order. A nursemaid held the children. A chauffeur held the machine that was replacing the carriage. All of those posts were bought for closeness. The senior personal staff of a rich house stood nearer to their employers than most of the family did. They stood behind the chair. They slept along the corridor. They were the last person spoken to at night and the first in the morning. A liner had 6 days to reproduce that arrangement inside a steel hull, ranks and corridors, and covered door included, and it had to charge for it. The line already had a category for this, and it came off the luggage. Trunks were marked in 2 ways. Some were labeled "Wanted on Voyage," meaning a steward could reach them during the crossing. The rest were labeled "Not Wanted on Voyage," and went into the hold at Southampton until New York. The same distinction was applied to the staff. A maid needed during the crossing was booked into first class on her employer's ticket, in a smaller room along the same corridor or a deck away, close enough to be reached quickly. She ate at separate sittings. She had no claim on the lounge, the reading room, or the restaurant. A cook was not needed, because the ship had its own kitchens. She went into second class at a flat fare, and did not see her employers again until the customs shed. That decision was taken in an office by people who never met most of these passengers. It determined where each of them slept. 6 days later, it determined something else. The first column runs like this: Rosalie Bidouin, 247 pounds, 10 shillings and sixpence. Grace Scott Bowen, governess to the Ryerson children, £262, 7 shillings and sixpence. Ellen Bird, maid to Ida Straus, £221, 15 shillings and sevenpence. Amalie Giger, maid to Eleanor Widener, £211 and 10 shillings. Margaret Fleming, maid to Marion Thayer, £110, 17 shillings and eightpence. The second column is shorter. Amelia Brown, cook, £13. Augustus Henry Aldworth, aged 35, chauffeur to the Carter family, £13. George Swain, aged 19, chauffeur to the Allisons. Renee Pernod, who drove for Benjamin Guggenheim. Edwin Charles Wheeler, who was one of 2 manservants George Widener brought aboard, and the only one placed below. Second class, all of them, on the cheapest tickets in this account. A governess crossed at 20 times a chauffeur's fare. The difference measured nothing about the skill of either. Driving a motor car in 1912 was newer work than dressing hair. The difference measured one thing only, which was whether an employer expected to need those particular hands between Southampton and New York. Proximity had a price, and the price bought a position in the ship. The households that paid it read like a directory of American and Canadian money. John Jacob Astor IV was the richest passenger aboard, returning from a honeymoon with his second wife Madeline, who was 18 and 5 months pregnant. 3 servants traveled with them in first class. Victor Robbins was his valet. Rosalie Bedois was her maid. Caroline Louise Endress was the nurse engaged for the pregnancy. Benjamin Guggenheim boarded at Cherbourg with his valet. Victor Gaetan Andrea Giglio, who was 24 and had been with him for years. Also in the party were Madame Leontine Aubart, who was his companion rather than his wife, and her maid, Emma Saygesser. 2 decks down, on a fare Guggenheim is unlikely to have looked at, rode his chauffeur, Renee Pernod. Isidor and Ida Straus, who owned Macy's, crossed with his English manservant John Farthing, aged 48, and her maid Ellen Bird, aged 31. Both had rooms of their own on C deck, which was a generous booking for staff. George Dunton Widener, of the Philadelphia streetcar fortune, traveled with his wife Eleanor and their son Harry. Edwin Herbert Keeping, aged 33, came as his valet in first class. Amalie Giger came as Eleanor's maid in first class. Edwin Charles Wheeler came as a manservant in second class. Hudson Joshua Creighton Allison, a Montreal financier of 30, crossed with his wife Bess, their daughter Lorraine, who was 2, and their son Trevor, who was 11 months old. The Allisons brought a complete traveling household. Sarah Daniels was Bess's lady's maid in first class. Alice Catherine Cleaver, age 22, was the nursemaid in first class, engaged about 2 weeks before sailing, after the family's own nurse declined at the last moment to make the trip. Amelia Brown was the cook in second class. George Swain was the chauffeur in second class. Arthur Ryerson, a steel millionaire, crossed with his wife Emily and 3 of their children under the worst possible circumstance. Their eldest son had been killed in a motor accident in America, and the family had taken passage home for the funeral. Victorine Chaudinson came as Emily's maid. Grace Scott Bowen came as the governess. William Ernest Carter of Philadelphia brought his wife Lucille, 2 children, the maid Augusta Jean Sarapla in first class, the chauffeur Aldworth in second class, and a new motor car in the hold. Charlotte Drake Cardeza took one of the 2 most expensive suites aboard, with a private promenade deck, traveling with her son Thomas, her maid Annie Moore Ward, and his manservant Louis Gustave Joseph Lesueur. John Borland Thayer, a railway vice president, brought his wife Marion, their son Jack, and Marion's maid Margaret Fleming. Frederick and Daisy Spedden brought their small son Douglas, his nursemaid Elizabeth Margaret Burns, and Daisy's maid Helen Alice Wilson. The Countess of Rothes brought her maid, Roberta Maioni, who was 19. Emma Bucknell brought Albina Bassani. Lucy Duff Gordon brought her secretary, Laura Francatelli, booked as a servant. Maria Josefa Penasco brought Fermina Oliva Iocana. Charles Melville Hayes, president of the Grand Trunk Railway, brought his secretary, Vivian Ponsonby Payne, who was 22, and his wife's maid, Marianne Perrot. Mahala Douglas brought Bertha Leroy. Henry Sleeper Harper brought back from Egypt a dragoman named Hamad Hassab. And Joseph Bruce Ismay, chairman of the line that owned the ship, brought his valet, Richard Thomas Fry, and his private secretary, William Henry Harrison. Counted together, somewhere between 30 and 40 people were aboard that ship for one reason, which was that somebody else did not intend to cross the ocean without them. They were not crew. They drew no wage from the line and answered to no officer. They were not ordinary passengers either. Almost none of them had chosen the ship, the date, the cabin, or the fare. Set that group against the ship. Something over 2,200 people were aboard when she sailed. Between 30 and 40 of them belonged to this category, which is a small fraction of a large number. It is also almost a fifth of the first-class passenger list, which is not small at all. Roughly 1 person in every 6 traveling first class was there to work for another passenger. Placement was not guaranteed, and this is where the arrangement shows its edges. Some servants were quartered on the same corridor as their employers. Others were put on E-deck, several levels below the people they served. Lucy Duff Gordon's secretary was one of those. The line fitted them in where it could, at a reduced fare, and on this voyage there was unusual room to do it, because the ship sailed a long way short of full. The paperwork settles how they were understood, and it settles it without ambiguity. On the surviving records, these people are entered as first-class passengers, with the word servant set beside the entry. Not crew, not family. Passenger, and then a second word narrowing what kind. Their occupation is recorded in the same column as their name, so the manifest carries personal maid, valet, nursemaid, governess, cook, and chauffeur alongside the fare. The document was built to hold that distinction. The crossing had already begun weeks earlier, in linen rooms in Montreal and Philadelphia and London. A first-class woman crossing the Atlantic did not pack a case. Her household prepared a shipment. Charlotte Cardeza traveled with 14 trunks, 4 suitcases, and 3 crates. That much is known because the contents were later itemized in a claim. Every gown in them had been checked, folded in tissue, and listed by somebody, and somebody had to be able to reassemble the whole shipment in a hotel at the other end without a single item going astray. That listing was itself a skill. The trunks themselves stood upright and opened like a wardrobe, hanging space on one side, drawers on the other, so that a cabin could be furnished out of them. Empty, they were heavy. Loaded, they were a two-man lift. They went up the gangway at Southampton on the morning of the 10th of April, carried by people who boarded by a different entrance from their employers. That evening, a tender brought the Astors, the Ryersons, the Guggenheims, and the Cardezas out from Cherbourg in the dark. By the time the ship left Queenstown on the 11th, the household had been rebuilt at sea. At the top of the scale, the reproduction was almost exact. The two grandest suites had private promenade decks of their own, enclosed strips of open air belonging to one party, and adjoining rooms intended for personal staff. Charlotte Cardeza held one of them. Her party of 4 included 2 servants, quartered so that a maid and a manservant could be summoned without either of them crossing a public corridor. A Philadelphia house had been lifted onto the water, more or less whole. At the other end, the arrangement is easier to describe, because there was almost nothing to it. Augustus Aldworth had been hired to drive a motor car. The motor car was in the hold and could not be driven at sea, so Aldworth was stored in second class on a flat fare with no duties and no access, 6 days of waiting for a job that resumed in New York. The car was below him. His employers were above him. He could reach neither. This was not a holiday with a change of scenery. A crossing was the same labor performed in a smaller space on a moving floor. The arrangements provided for a woman to change several times a day: morning dress, walking dress, tea gown, full evening dress with jewels and dressed hair. Each change made work. Sea air ruins fabric, salt reaches everything, and coal smoke leaves a gray film on white linen at speed. The valets had the same week in a different key, shaving a man on a moving ship and keeping shirt fronts stiff in a cabin with no proper press. Nothing about it was picturesque. There was a second reason these particular people were brought, beyond a pair of hands. A senior servant carried a household's working memory. Which gown had already been seen at which table? Which of the jewels were real, and which were the traveling copies? Which medicines were taken and when? Which letters were to be answered and which were never mentioned? A stewardess supplied by the ship could fasten a dress. She could not know any of that, and it was the knowledge rather than the labor that made the fare worth paying. None of them had a day off, because there is no day off at sea. The employer is never more than 60 feet away and never stops needing things. That requirement is what the fare paid for. On C deck and D deck there were rooms where 2 or 3 women who had never met shared a cabin. They brushed out their employer's hair late in the corridor to avoid waking each other. They compared households and traded the gossip of the trade. Mahala Douglas recorded going to her maid's room after the collision, which places it near her own. Ellen Bird had a room to herself, which was less usual. Below all of that, second class carried the cook, the chauffeurs, and the manservant. They ate in a different saloon, walked a different deck, and used stairways that did not run upward. Amelia Brown and George Swain both worked for the Allisons. Both were aboard. Neither of them saw Hudson or Bess Allison once between Southampton and the ice. On land, the Allison household was one organism sharing one building and one routine. At sea, it was cut cleanly in half by a fair, and the halves could not reach each other. The covered door had been rebuilt in steel and stretched across 4 decks. One further feature of the arrangement is worth stating exactly. The servants who traveled first class were not first-class passengers in any social sense. They did not enter the dining saloon or sit in the lounge. Their movement through the public rooms was errand rather than leisure. Roberta Maioni, 19 years old, spent that crossing in a first-class cabin on a first-class deck without once being a first-class passenger. The line had made a person who was inside the most privileged space on the North Atlantic without standing in it. They had the corridor. They did not have the room. So the thing the money had actually bought was not comfort and not status. It was a corridor, a specific length of carpet with a specific door on it, and a person behind that door who could be reached in under a minute. For 6 days, that was a convenience worth £247. It was about to be worth considerably more than that. One household crossed under a different weight. The Ryersons were traveling to a funeral, and a family in fresh mourning does not use a ship the way other passengers use it. Emily Ryerson kept largely to her rooms. That did not reduce the work. It moved it. Mourning had its own wardrobe, and its own rules about what could be worn and seen. And Victorine Chaudonson and Grace Bowen carried the household through 6 days of it, with 3 children still to be dressed, fed, and occupied. A smaller household shows the same structure at a domestic scale. Frederick and Daisy Spedden crossed with 1 child. Elizabeth Margaret Burns, aged 41, came as his nursemaid on a first-class ticket costing £134 and 10 shillings, and Helen Alice Wilson came as Daisy's maid. The boy called Burns by a name of his own invention, Muddy Boons, which is the sort of detail that survives only because somebody wrote it down at the time. Even the meals were arranged to keep the line intact. A maid in a first-class cabin did not eat in the first-class dining saloon. The arrangement set aside separate accommodation and separate sittings for personal servants, so that the people who dressed the passengers ate apart from the passengers they had dressed. It is a small provision, and it is the whole system in miniature. A woman could spend an hour lacing another woman into an evening gown, walk her to the head of a staircase, and then go and eat somewhere the gown was never seen. The service door had been redrawn in a place with no doors, purely by timetable. There is a distinction here that later accounts collapse almost every time, and it matters. The ship carried its own servants, a large victualling department of stewards and stewardesses assigned to sections of corridor, signed onto the ship's articles and paid by the line. They served whoever was in their rooms. The private staff served one family and were paid by that family. Both groups made beds and carried trays. Only one of them had a contract with the ship. 6 days later, that difference in paperwork would decide how an officer at a davit treated the woman in front of him. The placement was not uniform, and one booking shows the edge of it clearly. Lucy Duff Gordon, the couturier who traded under the name Lucille, was crossing with her husband and her secretary, Laura Francatelli. Francatelli was not a maid. She kept books and handled correspondence for a fashion house. She was nonetheless booked onto the ship as a servant, and quartered on E deck, several levels below the people she worked for. The category was elastic at the top and rigid at the bottom, and where a person landed inside it depended on what her employer had asked for and what the line had spare. For 6 days, that position was a matter of manners, where a person ate, who nodded, which stairway. The last full day of it was cold and bright and unusually calm, and passengers remarked on the flatness of the sea all afternoon. Reduced to its working parts, the whole arrangement comes to 3 lines. A servant an employer expected to need was placed within a minute's walk and charged at first-class rates. A servant an employer did not expect to need was placed 2 decks down and charged £13. And a servant of either kind remained, throughout, somebody else's property in every sense that the ship recognized, entered on another person's ticket, sleeping where that ticket said, eating when the timetable allowed. Grace Bowen crossed at 262 pounds. Amelia Brown crossed at 13. Neither figure had anything to do with either woman. The calm that passengers noticed had a second property that few of them had reason to think about. A flat sea gives an iceberg no line of white water at its base, which is the thing a lookout sees first at night. The air went on cooling through the afternoon and into the evening. By dinner it was cold enough that the promenade decks emptied early, and people who had spent the week walking outside stayed in. That evening George and Eleanor Widener gave a dinner in the restaurant on B deck in honor of Captain Edward Smith. The Thayers and the Carters were among the guests. It was the kind of gathering that required everything a great household could produce, and the people who produced it have already been named. Amalie Giger dressed Eleanor Widener. Margaret Fleming dressed Marion Thayer. Augusta Sarapla dressed Lucille Carter. Along the same corridor, Edwin Keeping laid out George Widener's evening clothes. 2 decks below, Edwin Wheeler had nothing to do, because he had not been wanted on voyage. The dinner broke up before 9 o'clock, and the captain went up to the bridge. 4 of the people who worked on that evening's clothes were women. All 4 were alive at breakfast on Thursday. Both of the men were dead within 5 hours. The shape of the ship matters at this point, and it was fixed long before anyone boarded. The boats sat on the topmost deck. They were reached by the forward first-class stairways and the entrances beside them. Second class had its own stairs, which served second class, and did not open onto those boat stations. Nobody built that as a hazard. It was built as privacy, so that the 2 kinds of passenger would not meet on the stairs. At about 20 minutes to midnight, the ship struck ice along her starboard side, and the question stopped being one of manners. The boat deck was reached from the first-class stairways. The officers worked outward from the forward first-class entrances. The women who had been quartered along the corridors of the rich, precisely so that they could reach the rich in under a minute, were standing in the correct part of the ship. The cook in second class was not. The clerk who typed £13 beside one name and £247 beside another had made no judgment about either life. He had made a judgment about an employer's convenience. By 4 o'clock the next morning, that judgment had sorted them. Every woman on the servants' roster was alive. Almost every man on it was dead. The collision was quiet. Survivors agreed on that afterwards. And it matters here more than it usually does, because the shock was felt according to where a person slept. High in the ship, in the paneled rooms on B deck, it was almost nothing. A tremor, a faint grinding somewhere forward. Several first-class passengers slept through it. Lower down and further out towards the hull, it was unmistakable. Alice Cleaver was 22 and had been in the Allisons' employment for a fortnight. She was sleeping in a first-class cabin with the 11-month-old boy in her charge. She felt the ship strike, and she was certain enough to go and wake her employers. What happened next survives in her own handwriting, in a letter she wrote in September of 1955, more than 40 years afterwards. She had difficulty, she wrote, persuading Mr. Allison to get up and go and see what had happened. The Allisons had not heard the collision. They thought she had imagined it. A nursemaid of a fortnight's standing stood in a corridor near midnight, trying to convince a financier that his ship had hit something. She was right and he was wrong. And the reason she was right is that her cabin was nearer the water than his. That inversion repeated across the ship. For about an hour, the servants of these households knew more about the situation than the people who employed them. They were quartered lower. They heard the engines stop. They saw stewards filling the corridors. They were awake, dressed and moving, while their employers were still deciding whether any of it was serious. What followed was an hour in which the household system worked exactly as it had been built to work. Between about 11:45 and 1:15, the upper corridors filled with a traffic no other emergency has produced. People who had not dressed themselves unaided in their adult lives were being dressed by professionals, at speed, for the purpose of standing outside in freezing air. Maids fastened boots. Valets found overcoats. Jewelry went into other people's pockets. Emily Ryerson, who had spent the crossing largely in her rooms, was got up and out by Victorine Chaudonson and Grace Bowen, who between them also had 3 children to dress. That family had not chosen the ship. They had booked the first fast passage available in order to bury a son. 6 days later, the father was dead as well. The ship's own women were doing the same work in parallel, and the two groups are constantly confused. 23 of the crew were women, being 2 restaurant cashiers, 1 matron, 18 stewardesses, and 2 Turkish bath attendants. They made beds, carried trays, dressed hair, and looked after frightened passengers, which is the labor Rosalie Bedois and Amélie Giger performed for a different employer. 20 of the 23 survived. The 3 lost were the third-class matron and 2 second-class stewardesses. Several of the surviving stewardesses were at first turned away from boats on the port side by Second Officer Lightoller, on the grounds that they were crew rather than passengers. They had to go and find another boat. 2 women of similar age, doing identical work, stood on the same deck. One was carried on the manifest as a first-class passenger because a family had paid her fare. The other was carried in the victualling department because the line paid her wages. The rule at that davit read the paperwork first. None of this had to be a surprise. Ice warnings had been coming in by wireless through the whole of that Sunday, from the Caronia, from the Baltic, from the America, from the Mesaba, from the Californian lying stopped in the field ahead. Not all of them reached the bridge. Some were carried up and read and set aside. The wireless operators were working through a backlog of private messages for passengers. The ordinary commercial traffic of a rich ship and ice reports competed with that traffic for a man's attention. The first boat did not go into the water until roughly an hour after the collision. The last of them left about 2 hours and 35 minutes after it. In between, several boats were lowered, a long way short of full, and the reason was that for most of that hour, a large number of people did not believe the ship was sinking. Standing on a warm, brightly lit, apparently level deck, and being asked to climb into a small wooden boat and be lowered 70 feet into a black sea, a great many passengers declined. The people who had been awake and dressed since the first minute did not have that hesitation to overcome. Aft on the port side, Boat 8 was loading. Ellen Bird was 31 and had been with the Strauses a relatively short time. Ida Straus was 63 and had been married for 41 years. Ida Straus went as far as the boat. By several accounts, she had 1 foot in it. Then she came back out and refused to leave without her husband, and Isidor Straus refused a place while other men remained aboard. Before she stepped away, Ida Straus took off her fur coat and gave it to Ellen Bird, saying she would not be needing it. Bird was put into Boat 8 and lived. The Strauses stayed and died. His body was recovered. Hers was not. The manservant, John Farthing, aged 48, stayed as well and died. His body was never recovered. That part of the scene is almost never told. Boat 8 got away short of men who could handle an oar. The person who took the tiller was Noel Leslie, the Countess of Roths, who had learned to steer small boats on holiday. Her 19-year-old maid, Roberta Maioni, was aboard the same boat. The Countess steered, and the maid rowed, for hours in the dark. By the time they reached the rescue ship, neither of those facts carried any rank at all. The same thing had already happened 1 boat forward. Ellen Mary Barber, age 26, maid to Mrs. Tyrell Cavendish, went away in Boat 6. So did Margaret Brown, a Denver mining fortune, who took an oar and spent much of the night arguing with the quartermaster about going back for the people in the water. History remembers one of those 2 women and has largely lost the other. They pulled on the same boat, in the same cold, for the same hours. On the starboard side, the same instruction was producing a different result. Charlotte Cardeza and her son Thomas came off in Boat 3. So did her maid, Annie Moore Ward. So did Louis Gustave Joseph Lesueur, Thomas Cardeza's manservant, who is one of only 2 men on the servants' roster to leave that ship alive. The 2 officers loading boats read the same order differently. On the starboard side, men were admitted when no women were waiting. On the port side, no adult male passenger passed at all. Lesueur was standing on the side that let men in. Elizabeth Margaret Burns was in Boat 3 as well, with the Spedden child in her care. Helen Wilson survived too. The whole Spedden household came through the night, which is close to unique in this account. The reason is arithmetic rather than luck. That party contained no adult man except the father, and he was led into a boat at a moment when no women were waiting. Further forward, on the same side, the small emergency boat numbered 1 went away with about 12 people in it. It had places for something close to 40. Among those 12 was Laura Mabel Francatelli, secretary to the couturier Lucy Duff Gordon, booked onto the ship as a servant. Sir Cosmo Duff Gordon, afterwards gave £5 to each of the crewmen who had rowed it. That payment became the most argued over transaction of the whole disaster. It occupied the British inquiry for days. 2 other households sorted themselves in ways worth setting side by side. Charles Melville Hayes, who ran the Grand Trunk Railway, died that night. So did his secretary, Vivian Ponsonby Payne, aged 22. Hayes's wife Clara and her maid Marianne Perraud both came off alive. William Ernest Carter left in a collapsible and survived. His chauffeur Augustus Aldworth, waiting 2 decks below on a £13 ticket with a motor car in the hold beneath him, did not. Lucille Carter would later cite her husband's conduct on that night in divorce proceedings. Everything this account has established so far arrives at about 1:45 in the morning at one boat. Boat 4 was the 8th boat lowered on the port side, and it went late. It had been lowered empty from the boat deck down to A deck so that passengers could board through the promenade windows, and there was a delay while those windows were opened. Quartermaster Walter Purkis was put in charge. Waiting around it were the women of 5 of the largest fortunes aboard. Madeline Astor, 18 and 5 months pregnant; Eleanor Widener, Marion Thayer, Emily Ryerson with 3 of her children, Lucille Carter with her son and daughter. Standing in the same crowd on the same deck, waiting for the same boat, were 7 servants. Rosalie Bidois, 46, maid to Madeline Astor; Caroline Louise Endres, 39, her nurse; Amelie Henriette Giger, 35, maid to Eleanor Widener; Margaret Fleming, 42, maid to Marion Thayer; Victorine Chaudinson, 36, maid to Emily Ryerson; Grace Scott Bowen, 45, governess to the Ryerson children; Augusta Jean Sarapla, maid to Lucille Carter. All 7 were taken in. All 7 lived. John Jacob Astor IV walked his wife to that boat and asked whether he might come as well, given her condition. He was refused. Women and children only. He stepped back. He died a little over half an hour later. His valet, Victor Robbins, died with him. George Widener put his wife and her maid into that boat. He died. His son Harry died. His valet, Edwin Keeping, aged 33, died. His manservant, Edwin Wheeler, 2 decks below in 2nd class, died without ever learning that the rest of them were at the rail. Arthur Ryerson put his wife, his daughters, his son, his maid, and his governess into that boat and stayed. He died. His 13-year-old son, John, was nearly refused. An officer is said to have tried to stop the boy on the grounds that he was old enough to remain with the men. He was let through. John Borland Thayer put his wife and Margaret Fleming into the boat and died. Their son, Jack, survived on an overturned collapsible. Boat 4 went down the side with about 30 people aboard, and afterwards it was one of very few that turned back. They pulled 8 crewmen out of the water. 2 of them, William Lyons and Sidney Siebert, were so far gone with cold that they died in the bottom of the boat shortly after being hauled in. By the time it reached the rescue ship, that boat held 5 widows, 7 working women employed to dress those widows, several children, and 2 dead sailors in the bottom. Every person in it who earned a wage was a woman. Every one of them survived. Every man who employed them was dead, and so was every man who worked for them. The other half of that sentence was standing on the deck above. Benjamin Guggenheim was 56. He had come aboard at Cherbourg with his valet Victor Giglio, who was 24, with Madame Leontine Aubart, and with her maid Emma Saygesser. Both women were put into a boat, and both survived. Guggenheim and Giglio did not go with them. A surviving steward described the two men returning to their cabins, changing out of the lifebelts and jerseys they had been given, and coming back up in full evening dress. By that steward's account, Guggenheim said they had dressed in their best and were prepared to go down like gentlemen. That line has been repeated for over a century. It reaches us second-hand, from one man reporting what he heard on a sinking ship, and nobody who stood on that deck lived to confirm the words. What is not in question is what the two of them were wearing when they were last seen. The part that goes missing from that scene is the valet. Victor Giglio was an employee of 24 with no stake in the smelting business. Nothing required him to be on that deck. He was there because his employer was there, which is what the position meant. Neither body was recovered. 3 decks below, in second class, the chauffeur René Pernot was also going to die, and no one recorded a line about him at all. Which leaves the household this act began with, and the only one aboard that lost a child. Cleaver's letter continues. Some long time after the engines stopped, Hudson Allison went away to find out what the trouble was. While he was gone, Cleaver was warned they would have to leave the ship. She dressed the children. She dressed Bess Allison, who became hysterical and had to be calmed. An officer came round to close the cabins and sent them up on deck. Outside the cabin they met Hudson Allison again, and by her account he seemed too dazed to speak. She handed him brandy and asked him to look after his wife and Lorraine while she kept the baby. Then, she wrote, confusion arose outside about which deck they should go to. That is the sentence the whole thing turns on. Not a decision. Not an argument. A crowded corridor at 1 a.m, and a family that went one way and a nursemaid who went another. Cleaver carried Trevor Allison up to the boat deck and got into boat 11. A first-class bedroom steward named William Faulkner held the child while she climbed in and handed him down to her. Somewhere in the same boat, having come up from second class, was Amelia Mary Brown, aged 18, the family's cook. Boat 11 was loaded from A deck rather than from the boat deck above, and it went away more heavily filled than most. So the two women from the Allison household spent the rest of that night pressed among strangers, holding a child who belonged to neither of them, whose parents neither of them would see again. They had been separated for 6 days by a difference of 234 pounds in fare. They were now sitting on the same thwart. Amelia Brown was 18. Alice Cleaver was 22. Between them, they were the surviving staff of a household that no longer had anybody to serve, carrying the only member of it left alive. 2 women from one household who had not spoken in 6 days, sat in the same boat, holding the same family's son. Nobody else from that household reached a lifeboat. Hudson Allison died. Bess Allison died. Lorraine Allison, aged 2, died, and she is recorded as the only child traveling first class who was lost. In second class, George Swain, the chauffeur, aged 19, died as well. He had not seen his employers since Southampton. What kept the Allisons aboard was, on the family's later understanding, the search. That understanding was formed when Cleaver and Brown described the night to Hudson Allison's brother George, and it holds that the parents did not know the baby was safe. The record is careful at this point, and this account will be careful with it. There is no firm evidence that Cleaver failed to tell them. Her own letter describes an arrangement rather than a disappearance. Whether the message reached Bess Allison, or reached her and was lost in panic, or never traveled past her husband, is recorded nowhere. What is recorded is that a family stayed aboard, looking for a child who was already in a boat. Taken as one movement, the Allison household did exactly what its bookings had arranged for it to do. The nursemaid was quartered close to the child, and so the child left the ship. The lady's maid was quartered close to the mistress, and she left the ship as well. The cook was stored in second class where nothing could reach her, and she survived because of a rule that had nothing to do with her employer. The chauffeur was stored in the same place, and the same rule killed him. And the two people who had paid for all four of those placements stayed on a tilting deck, looking for a boy who had gone up a first-class stairway 20 minutes earlier. The system worked. It simply did not work for them. By this point in the night, the pattern is no longer a matter of one household. Astor lost his valet. Guggenheim lost his valet and his chauffeur. Straus lost his manservant. Widener lost both of his, one from each fare class. The Allisons lost their chauffeur, and the Carters lost theirs. Hayes lost his secretary. 3 further men entered on the roster simply as servants. Alexander Cairns, Sante Regini, and Henry Charles Harrington went down with them. And the chairman of the line lost both of the men who worked for him. Richard Fry was his valet, and William Harrison was his private secretary. Both died. Ismay left in a collapsible and lived. 2 men from that roster survived. Gustave Lesueur in boat 3 with the Cardezas, and Hamid Hassab, the dragoman Henry Sleeper Harper had engaged in Egypt, who came off in boat 3 as well, alongside Harper, his wife, and a small dog. The 2 exceptions left from the same boat, on the same side, at about the same time. The dog survived too. Against that, the women went out one after another in almost every boat that left. Ellen Barber, boat 6, Albina Bassani, boat 8, Nellie Bassett, boat 8, Ellen Bird, boat 8, Elizabeth Burns, boat 3, Rosalie Bidois, Grace Bowen, Victorine Chaudinson, Caroline Endress, Margaret Fleming, Amelie Giger, and Augusta Sarapla, boat 4, Alice Cleaver and Amelia Brown, boat 11, Sarah Daniels, Berthley Roy, Emily Croykin, Elise Lorette, Roberta Maioni, Fermina Oliva Iocana, Mary Ann Perrot, Emma Saygesser, Annie Moore Ward, Helen Wilson, Laura Francatelli, Rose Amelie Icard, Elizabeth Schutz. Every name on that list is a survivor. By about 2 o'clock, the wooden boats had gone, and the bow was well under. 4 collapsible craft remained, 2 of them still lashed to the roof of the officers' quarters. Collapsible C went off the starboard side, with Ismay aboard. Collapsible D got away with a few more women. Collapsible A floated off swamped, and the people who reached it stood in freezing water inside the boat all night. Collapsible B came off upside down, and about 30 men balanced on its hull until morning. shifting their weight together to keep it from rolling. Jack Thayer was one of them. His mother was in Boat 4 with Margaret Fleming, and neither of them knew the boy was alive. His father was already dead. At about 2:20, the ship broke apart and went down by the head. The sea was around 28 degrees on the Fahrenheit scale, below the freezing point of fresh water. Nobody in it lasted long. By dawn, there were about 710 people alive in the boats, out of somewhere over 2,200 who had sailed. What followed the sinking lasted about 20 minutes, and is the part of the night least often described. Something over 1,500 people were in the water at once, most of them wearing life belts, most of them able to stay afloat. They did not drown. In water at that temperature, the body loses heat faster than it can produce it, and a person stops being able to move, then stops being able to hold his head clear. The boats lying a few hundred yards off could hear it happening. Only 2 of them went back in any real sense, and one of those was Boat 4, which by then held 5 widows and 7 of their servants, and pulled 8 men out. 2 of the 8 died in the bottom of the boat anyway. Among the living was every woman who had come aboard to work in a private household. Among the dead were almost all the men who had come aboard to do the same. The households had not been divided by loyalty on that deck. Several of the men could have gone and did not, and several more were simply refused. They were divided by a rule about sex that took no interest in who paid whom, and by a schedule of fares settled months earlier by clerks who never left an office. When the sun came up, a Montreal cook and a Montreal nursemaid were sitting in a lifeboat with a baby between them. That was the Allison household. All of it. 4 decks of it. 2 fare classes of it. A family of 4 and 4 people employed to look after them had come down in one night to 2 young women and a child who would not remember any of it. Set the households aside and take the roster on its own. Maids, valets, nursemaids, governesses, cooks, chauffeurs, manservants, and the 2 secretaries who traveled on servants' terms. Between 30 and 40 people, spread across 2 fare classes, working for about 20 families. Of the women, every one survived. Of the men, 2. The ship as a whole gives the denominator. About 710 people lived out of somewhere over 2,200, which is roughly 1 in 3. Broken down the way the inquiry broke it down, about 97 in every 100 first-class women were saved, and about 1 in 3 first-class men. In second class, about 86 women in 100 and about 8 men. In third class, roughly half the women and about 1 man in 6. Hold the first-class male figure, 1 in 3. Now take the men on the servants' roster. 14 died and 2 lived, which is about 1 in 8. The manservants of the richest passengers aboard died at roughly twice the rate of the rich men they worked for. One further figure has to sit under all of this, because without it, the rest can be misread as a series of choices. The ship carried 20 boats. Between them, they had places for about 1,178 people. There were somewhere over 2,200 aboard. Even if every boat had gone away packed to the gunwale, and none of them did, about half the people on that ship were going to die before the arithmetic began. That changes the question. Nobody on those decks was deciding who deserved to live. They were deciding, under a rule handed down in the previous 10 minutes, which half of the ship went into a finite number of seats. Everything this account has described is the answer to that sorting question, and the sorting was done by sex first, and by deck second, and by nothing else at all. That is not what the arrangement predicts. These were healthy men, mostly in their 20s and 30s, quartered on first-class corridors, standing on the same decks as their employers, often within arm's reach of them. They should have done at least as well. They did considerably worse. 3 explanations account for it, and they stack. The first is the rule. Women and children first was not a law of the sea. It was an instruction given by officers on the night, and on the port side it was applied absolutely. No adult male passenger passed, whatever his name or his fare. John Jacob Astor IV, who could have bought the ship, asked to accompany his pregnant wife and was told no. If Astor could not get in, a valet was never getting in. It is worth knowing where that rule came from, because its authority is not what people assume. Women and children first is associated with the loss of a troop ship called the Birkenhead off South Africa in 1852, where the soldiers were held in ranks on deck while the boats took the women and children off. The custom took hold from there. It became a point of honor in the merchant service, and then a point of national self-image. It was never written into the regulations. It appears in no statute and in no company rule book. It was a custom, 60 years old, carried in the heads of the men who happened to be loading boats that night. 2 of those men read it differently, which is why Boat 3 had a manservant in it and Boat 4 did not. The second is geography, and this is where the fare column does its work. The women who survived did so partly because they were standing exactly where boats were being loaded, and that was not luck. They had been placed on those corridors, at those prices, so that they could reach their employers in under a minute. The Widener household paid £211 and 10 shillings for Amalie Giger to sleep near Eleanor Widener. On one night, that money bought a place at the rail. 2 decks below, the same household's manservant, Edwin Wheeler, had bought 13 pounds of ship. The second-class stairways served second class, and did not open onto those boat stations. Every male servant traveling second class died, all 4 of them: Wheeler, Swain, Aldworth, Pernod. Not one of them saw the family he worked for again after Southampton. Amelia Brown traveled second class on identical terms and lived, because she was a woman. Same fare, same deck, same ignorance of what was happening above. One rule separated them. The third explanation is the one that closes the gap, and it is the least comfortable. They stayed on purpose. A first-class gentleman who was refused a place had, in a sense, been given his answer. A valet's work did not stop at the rail. His employer was on deck, so he was on deck. Victor Giglio went below with Benjamin Guggenheim to change into evening clothes at 1 a.m. on a sinking ship. John Farthing did not leave Isidor Straus. Edwin Keeping did not leave George Widener. Richard Fry did not leave Bruce Ismay, although Ismay left the ship without him. The rule that killed them was not the officers' rule. It was the households. One group has been missing from this count, and leaving it out would make the argument look tidier than it is. Third class was full of domestic servants, not private staff attached to a party, but young women and men crossing on their own account to take up posts in American houses, carrying their own fares and their own boxes. They did the same work as Rosalie Bidouat for people they had not yet met. About half the third-class women survived, and about 1 man in 6. So a maid's survival did not follow from being a maid. It followed from which deck her employer had paid to put her on. Set the two groups against each other, and the fare column stops being a curiosity. A woman who cleaned and sewed and minded children in third class had a survival chance of roughly 1 in 2. A woman doing identical work on a first-class corridor had a survival chance of 1. The difference between them was not skill, character, nationality, or luck. It was whether somebody with money had decided in advance that they would need her during the crossing. Those 14 have been a list for 100 years, and they were not a list. Victor Giglio was 24 and had been born in Liverpool. He had been with Guggenheim long enough that the work had stopped being a matter of shirts and razors. He handled arrangements. He traveled wherever his employer traveled. He died in evening dress and was never found. Edwin Herbert Keeping was 33, valet to George Widener, and one of the few whose body was recovered from the sea. The family that had employed him arranged for him to be brought back. John Farthing was 48, the oldest of them, and had served Isidor Straus for years. He had every practical reason to go to a boat, and stayed with a man who was not going to one. George Swain was 19 and drove a motor car, and he died about 150 feet from where his employers died, with none of them aware that the others were still aboard. Augustus Aldworth was 35. René Pernod has left almost nothing behind but his name and his fare. Vivian Ponsonby Payne was 22. Private secretary to a railway president, and not a domestic servant at all. He was an educated young man at the start of a serious career, traveling with his chief. Both of them died. Richard Thomas Fry had been valet to the chairman of the line that owned the ship. Ismay lived another 25 years under a cloud that never lifted. Nobody has written a book about Richard Fry. The word servant is doing a great deal of work on that manifest, and it hides most of what these people actually were. Caroline Endress was a trained nurse, engaged because a pregnancy needed medical attendance at sea. Hamad Hassab was a dragoman, which meant an interpreter, a guide, and a fixer capable of moving a wealthy foreigner through Egypt and its languages and its officials. Laura Francatelli ran the correspondence of a fashion house with an international clientele. Vivian Payne was a railway president's private secretary at 22. Grace Bowen was a governess, which meant she was the education of 3 children. One column on one document turned all of that into the same word. That flattening had a consequence beyond insult. When the accounts were written and the lists compiled, a nurse and a chauffeur and a business secretary went into the same undifferentiated block, and a block is easy to skip. It is why these people appear in most tellings of this disaster as a texture rather than as individuals, mentioned once to establish that the rich traveled with staff, and then dropped. 14 of them died. The number is small enough to name, and has almost never been named. There is another group aboard who died of the same thing, and naming them makes the shape unmistakable. Every one of the ship's engineer officers died. Not most of them, all. They stayed below, keeping the electric light and the pumps running, while the water rose around them, and they did it long past the point at which any of them could have reached a boat. That was not treated as strange at the time. It was understood as what an engineer was for. That is the same reasoning that kept Victor Giglio on the boat deck in a dinner jacket. The difference is what happened afterwards. The engineers were given a large bronze memorial at Southampton, raised by public subscription and unveiled before a crowd. The musicians were given one. The postal clerks were given a plaque. 14 valets, chauffeurs, and manservants were given nothing anywhere. Both groups stayed at their posts. One is remembered as heroic, and the other is not remembered. And the difference between them is that the engineers worked for a company and the valets worked for a family. So the men died of service and the women lived of it. And the thing they died and lived of was identical. A maid was kept near her mistress. A valet was kept near his master. When the ship began to go, that closeness put both of them at the boats. Then a rule about sex came down the deck and cut the group in half. The half kept close to women was saved by proximity. The half kept close to men was killed by it. Same work, same corridor, same wage structure, opposite outcomes, decided by nothing either half had any say in. Which means that for about 1 hour, at one davit, the arrangement of the Gilded Age was suspended. At the rail of Boat 4, Rosalie Bidois, a 46-year-old lady's maid, outranked John Jacob Astor IV. Not in money, in the only currency that counted at that davit, which was the right to sit down. She went, and he did not, and neither of them chose it. Then the boats pulled away and the old arrangement came back, and it came back hard. One objection has to be dealt with, because it is the obvious one. It could be argued that these men had no real choice, and that talk of them staying on purpose is a compliment paid after the fact. The record does not settle it either way, and it should not be made to. What can be said is narrow. Boats went away from the starboard side with empty places, while men stood on the deck. Collapsible C left with the chairman of the line aboard. Emergency Boat 1 left about a third full. Some of the 14 were certainly refused. Whether any of them were offered a place and declined it is nowhere recorded, and nobody who could have answered that question came back. Put the three together, and the whole pattern resolves into one sentence. The rule decided sex. The fare decided deck. The job decided whether a person stayed after being refused. A woman on a first-class corridor cleared all three and lived without exception. A woman in second class cleared the first and failed the second, and lived anyway, because the first was decisive. A man on a first-class corridor failed the first, and then the third kept him at the rail after the answer was given. A man in second class failed the first and the second together, and never even reached the place where the question was asked. Every outcome on that roster falls out of those three lines, and not one of the three was chosen by the person it fell on. What the households thought of these people is clearest in what got said about them once it was over. A version went around almost immediately in which 4 maids had been trapped below decks and drowned in their cabins, abandoned. It appeared in print and was repeated for decades, because it fitted what people wanted to believe about how servants were treated. It was not true. The researcher Michael Findley went through the records and identified all 4 women named in that story. Every one of them had survived. The tale had been assembled out of confusion and a certain appetite for cruelty, and it attached itself to real women who were alive at the time and for years afterwards. Then there is what was done to Alice Cleaver. She came off that ship with a child who was not hers, having lost a 2-year-old, an employer and an employer's wife. She was 22. In New York, she was surrounded by reporters and told them her name was Jean, which is the behavior of somebody who wants to be left alone. Within a fairly short time, the story hardened into an accusation. She had taken the child. She had not told the mother. In the harshest tellings, she had caused 3 deaths by walking off with a baby. Then something worse happened, and it was the fault of the people who wrote it down. There had been another woman in England called Alice Cleaver. Alice Mary Cleaver, not Alice Catherine Cleaver. No relation, and no connection beyond a first name and a surname that were both entirely ordinary. In 1909, Alice Mary Cleaver had killed her infant son by throwing him under a train. She was convicted of murder. Her sentence was commuted, and she died of tuberculosis in 1915. At some point, the 2 women were merged. The nursemaid who saved a baby was written up in books and later on television as a woman who had murdered one. That falsehood ran for the better part of a century. It was still running after she was dead. Alice Catherine Cleaver died in Winchester in 1984 at the age of 95. She had married a clerk in 1918 and raised 2 daughters. By every account, she refused for the rest of her life to talk about the ship. She wrote one letter in 1955 and signed it with her married name. Then she stopped. The reason that particular accusation stuck so easily is that she was a servant. There is an old habit in how these stories get written of looking for the failure at the bottom of a household rather than at the top. Somebody has to have been careless with the Allison children. It will not be the parents. It will not be the line that sold the tickets. And it will not be the officer who lowered boats half empty. So it is the nursemaid, 22 years old, 2 weeks in the job, and the only person in that household who got a child off the ship. The same instinct followed the 2 men who survived. Gustave Lesueur and Hamad Hassab both came off in boat 3, and both then carried the murmured question that every male survivor carried, which was how exactly they had managed it when so many better men had not. Neither man ever answered it in print. Bruce Ismay got that question loudest, and for the rest of his life. His valet got nothing, because nobody asks what happened to the valet. The ship's own servants at least had a place that grieved for them. Most of the crew were signed on at Southampton, and the loss came down on a small number of streets in that town, with a concentration that is hard to take in. Whole roads lost men from several houses at once. Schools recorded children whose fathers had gone. That town has never stopped counting. The private staff had nothing like that. They came from Kentish Town, and from Hampshire, and from France, and from Egypt, and from wherever a particular family had happened to hire them. They died as 14 unrelated people scattered across 4 countries, attached to nobody's payroll. There was no street that lost them together. That is one reason the record is so thin. Grief needs somewhere to gather, and theirs had nowhere. There is a further silence here, and this one is official. 2 inquiries were held, one in Washington and one in London. Between them, they took evidence from officers, seamen, stokers, stewards, wireless operators, shipbuilders, and company men. In London, the only passengers called to give evidence in person were Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon, and they were called because of £5 notes handed to the crew of a boat that left less than a third full. Laura Francatelli had been in that same boat. Her account went in as a signed affidavit. Her employers went into the witness box. Consider what that left out. Between 30 and 40 people had been awake, dressed and moving in the first-class corridors from the moment of the collision. Several of them had personally woken the passengers who later testified. Alice Cleaver had gone to the Allisons' door. Maids had been in and out of cabins for an hour. For an account of what actually happened on B and C deck between midnight and 1 o'clock, they were the best witnesses aboard. They were not called because nobody thought of them as witnesses. So the record of that hour is mostly the record kept by the people who were being dressed, and not by the people doing the dressing. The surviving women went home and, with a handful of exceptions, said nothing. Elizabeth Schutz, governess to Margaret Graham, left a published account. Roberta Maioni told her story more than once. Most of the rest went back to work. Rosalie Bidois stayed in Madeline Astor's service. Ellen Bird kept a coat she had been given by a woman who drowned and lived until 1949. Sarah Daniels, Victorine Chaudinson, Amélie Giger, Margaret Fleming, Augusta Sarapla, Grace Bowen, and Caroline Endress left barely a sentence between them. They had come through the most reported disaster of their century, and they went back to fastening other people's boots. It is worth being exact about what can and cannot be known about these people, because the gap is the finding. For almost all of them, the surviving record contains a name, an age, a nationality, an employer, a ticket, a fare, and either a boat number or a blank. That is the whole file. Their occupation is recorded because a shipping company needed it for the manifest. Their employer is recorded because the fare was paid on his account. Very little else about any of them was written down by anybody, at the time or afterwards, and the reason is not that their lives were small. It is that nobody, whose job it was to write things down, thought they were the subject. A thin file has a particular danger, which both of those false stories demonstrate. When almost nothing is recorded about a person, almost anything can be added later, and nothing in the record will contradict it. 4 maids could be drowned in print for 80 years, because no document said otherwise. A nursemaid could be given another woman's conviction because there was no counterweight of biography to stop it. The people with full files, the Astors and the Wideners and the Strauses, are difficult to lie about. The people with one line each are not. Why they said so little is not recorded, and there are at least 3 reasons available. One is that talking would have cost them work, because a servant who gives newspaper interviews about a former employer is a servant nobody else hires. Another is that several of them had watched the people who paid them die, and there is no comfortable way to describe that in public while still being in the family's employment. The third is simply that nobody asked, and an account nobody wants tends not to get written. The evidence does not choose between these. It only shows the result, which is that 27 women came through that night and left almost nothing behind about it. There is one place where a figure was actually put on these people, and it is not a memorial or an inquiry. It is a schedule of loss. When the claims were filed, somebody wrote down what the trunks were worth and what the dead were worth, in the same case, on facing pages. That document survives. 4 years after the ship went down, in July of 1916, a group of lawyers in New York agreed a figure, $664,000. That was the whole of it. Every life lost, every trunk lost, every claim brought by every family of every passenger and every crewman, settled in one sum, by negotiation, without a trial. The company that owned the ship went into an American court and asked to limit what it owed. That was ordinary practice. Under the law as it stood, a ship owner could cap its exposure at the value of what remained of the vessel and the freight it had earned. What remained of the vessel was on the bottom of the Atlantic. The freight had gone with it, so the line's opening position was that it owed very close to nothing. Against that, the claims came in from both sides of the ocean, and together they asked for more than $16 million. One of those claims is worth reading in detail because the household reappears in it, itemized. Charlotte Drake Cardeza had survived in Boat 3. So had her son Thomas, her maid Annie Moore Ward, and Thomas's manservant Gustave Lesueur. That party is one of very few in this account that came through the night complete. Nobody in it died. They had crossed in one of the 2 grandest suites aboard, and they had brought 14 trunks, 4 suitcases, and 3 crates. The claim runs to nearly 20 pages and lists something over 840 separate items. It is the largest and most detailed property claim in the whole case. The single most valuable object on it was a pink diamond ring of 6 7/8 carats, valued at $20,000. The total claimed was $177,352.75. Set that beside the settlement. Every death and every loss on that ship came to $664,000. One woman's luggage claim was more than a quarter of it. Nobody received what they claimed, and the 2 figures are not the same kind of number. One is what a person asked for, the other is what a court eventually approved. But the asking is the record of what things were thought to be worth, written down at the time by the people who owned them. In the same body of paperwork, on the same docket, sat the claims for the dead. A wrongful death claim of that period was generally valued on earning capacity and financial dependence. It was not a claim about grief. It was arithmetic. What did this person earn? How long might they have gone on earning it? And who was relying on the money? For a railway president, that produced a very large number. For a 19-year-old chauffeur, it did not. The Carters had brought a new motor car in the hold and a chauffeur to drive it. Both went down with the ship. Both appear in the case. The vehicle is on a schedule of lost property. Augustus Aldworth is somewhere else in the same proceedings. The same lawyers converted both of them into dollars in the same room. There is a whole class of loss in this affair that produced no claim, because it was not worth the paper. Every woman who got into a boat did so in what she was wearing. Everything else went down. Clothes, savings, for those who kept them in a cabin, which many people did, letters, photographs, whatever small jewelry a woman on a servant's wage had gathered over years. For Charlotte Cardeza, the loss of a wardrobe was a 20-page schedule. For Amelia Brown, aged 18, the loss of a wardrobe was the wardrobe. There was no practical route to recovering it, because the sums would not have covered a lawyer's time, and because the whole apparatus of claiming assumed a claimant who already had money. The people best equipped to be compensated were the people who had lost the least that mattered. The people who had lost everything they owned were, in most cases, not in the paperwork at all. The settlement did not divide neatly. Death claims and property claims were weighed against each other by lawyers with every reason to keep both down, and no claimant received the sum originally demanded. It also took 4 years. A widow in 1912 who had lost the income she lived on waited until 1916 to learn what a court thought her husband had been worth, and in the meantime, she had to live on something. Delay is its own kind of judgment. It falls hardest on the people who cannot wait. In Britain, a separate mechanism ran for the crew and the poorer dead. The Titanic Relief Fund raised a very large sum by public subscription and paid pensions to widows and dependents. It also graded them. The administrators divided beneficiaries into classes, and a widow's weekly payment depended on which class her husband had belonged to. An officer's widow received more than a seaman's. A seaman's received more than a trimmer's. The reasoning given at the time was that people should not be lifted above the station they had occupied, and that a sudden excess of money would do them harm. A grieving woman in Southampton was therefore paid according to her dead husband's rank, on the theory that too much would spoil her. The bodies pulled out of the North Atlantic in the weeks afterwards were sorted, and it is worth knowing how. The recovery ships could not preserve everyone. Bodies identified as first-class passengers were embalmed and coffined and brought back to Halifax for their families. Many others were buried at sea, because there was neither coffin space nor embalming fluid to do otherwise. Identification and treatment were influenced by clothing. So a man in evening dress went into a coffin, and a man in working clothes went over the side. 6 days after the ship sank, in open water, the household hierarchy was still running. The bodies that came ashore went into cemeteries at Halifax, and a great many of those graves carry no name. They carry a number, which is the number the recovery ship assigned when the body came over the rail. Rows of them stand there still. Edwin Keeping is not among the numbered ones, because a Philadelphia household paid to have him identified and buried under his own name. That is the whole of the difference between a valet who is remembered and a valet who is a figure on a stone. Somebody upstairs decided it was worth the cost. The 2 inquiries had already finished by the time the money was settled. The American one sat first, moving fast, questioning officers and crew and a number of prominent passengers, and it reported before the British one had concluded. The British one heard from the trade and from 2 passengers. Between them, they produced recommendations about boats, bulkheads, wireless watches, and ice patrols, all of which were needed and most of which were adopted. Neither of them produced a single page about the people who had been carried aboard as part of somebody's luggage. Before any of that paperwork existed, the survivors had to get off a ship in New York. The rescue ship reached New York on the evening of the 18th of April, with a very large crowd waiting at the pier. Reporters were waiting, photographers were waiting, cars were waiting for the families. Alice Cleaver came down that gangway carrying a child who was not hers, in the clothes she had worn for 4 days, and told the reporters her name was Jean. Amelia Brown came down it as well. There were no cars waiting for either of them. Cleaver went home to England with nothing but a reputation she had not earned. In 1918, she married a widower named Edward Williams, a clerk who later made surgical appliances, and they had 2 daughters. She lived in Hampshire. She gave no interviews, wrote no book, and attended none of the commemorations that other survivors attended for decades. She did one thing. In 1955, she wrote to Walter Lord, and she signed it with her married name rather than her own. 43 years later, she was still using a different name. She died on the 1st of November, 1984, at 95, and was cremated at Southampton, in the town the ship had sailed from. Where her ashes went is not recorded. Hudson Trevor Allison, the baby she carried up to Boat 11, was raised in Montreal by his father's family and inherited a share of a substantial fortune. He grew up as the boy who had survived the Titanic, which is not an easy thing to be. He died on the 7th of August, 1929, aged 18. So the child lived 17 more years, and the woman who saved him lived another 72. And for most of that time, she was being described in print as somebody else entirely. There is a coda to that household. In 1940, a woman went on American radio and announced that she was Lorraine Allison, taken off the ship as a small child and raised under another name. She gave details. She named a rescuer. The family did not accept it, and she and her descendants persisted for decades. In December of 2013, the matter was settled with mitochondrial DNA. Samples were taken from a female line descendant of the claimant and a female line relative of Bess Allison. There was no genetic relationship at all. Lorraine Allison died on the 15th of April, 1912, age 2, somewhere on a deck or in a corridor, looking for a brother who was already safe. Ellen Bird kept the coat. She had been in that household a short time. Ida Straus had put the fur into her hands on the boat deck with a remark about not needing it, and Bird had been rowed away in Boat 8 while her employers stood at the rail. She had the coat on when she landed. When she reached New York, she went to the family and tried to give it back. Sarah Straus Hess, the eldest daughter, would not take it, and told her that her mother had given it to her and it was hers. Ellen Bird lived until 1949. Rosalie Bedois stayed in Madeleine Astor's service afterwards. A woman of 46 went on dressing a widow of 18, the two of them having sat in the same boat and watched the same ship go down with the same man aboard. Whatever passed between them after that is written nowhere. The others scattered and mostly went quiet. Roberta Maione, 19 when she rowed a boat under a countess, told her story more than once in later years. Elizabeth Schutz published hers. Laura Francatelli, who had put her account into an affidavit rather than a witness box, wrote letters about that night which stayed in private hands for the better part of a century. Fermina Oliva y Ocana went back to Spain. Bertha Leroy went back to work for the Douglas family. Emma Saygesser, who had been in the party of a man remembered for a sentence about evening dress, is remembered for nothing at all. None of them was ever asked, in any official setting, what they had seen. The houses themselves came apart at different speeds. The Wideners lost a master and an heir on the same night. Eleanor Widener went home to an estate built around a man who was no longer in it, and funded a library at Harvard in her son's memory. It still stands and still carries his name. The valet who had laid out George Widener's clothes for the captain's dinner was buried in Nova Scotia. The Strauses lost both principals at once. The Allisons lost 3 of 4 members and continued in the person of an 11-month-old boy. The Ryersons buried a father and a son inside a week. Each of those collapses put people out of work, and that appears in none of the memorials. When a great house loses its master, the staff are dismissed or absorbed or pensioned, according to the temper of the widow. There is no monument anywhere to a second footman let go in the summer of 1912, because a household had contracted. It happened in Philadelphia and in Montreal and in New York, in the months after the ship went down, to people who had never been near an iceberg. The arrangement itself had less than a generation left, though nobody aboard could have known it. Within 2 years, the war took the men who would have been footmen and valets and put them in uniform, and it took the women who would have been housemaids and put them in factories and offices where the hours were fixed and the pay was better. Very few of them came back through the service door afterwards. The great staffed household did not end because a ship sank. It ended because the people who staffed it found somewhere else to go. But the version of it that crossed the Atlantic in April of 1912, complete with its fare schedule and its covered door, was already close to the end of its time. Consider what the money did afterwards, because that is the part these families would have cared about most. The Allison fortune passed to an infant who died at 18. The Widener fortune passed to a widow who spent a great deal of it on a building for a dead son. The Astor fortune passed partly to a boy born 4 months after his father drowned. In each case, a household that had been assembled over decades to preserve and transmit wealth did transmit it, exactly as designed, to people who had not expected to receive it that year. The machinery worked. It simply ran through a night it had not been built for, and it ran on the backs of people whose names are on the same manifest and on nothing else, which leaves the question of who was given a stone, and that has a short answer. Southampton commemorates its dead properly. There is a bronze memorial to the engineers, raised by public subscription. There is one to the musicians and one to the crew, and there are plaques in churches and schools across that town, because Southampton lost hundreds of men in one night and has never quite stopped mourning them. Manhattan has a memorial to Isidor and Ida Straus. Cambridge in Massachusetts has one of the largest university libraries in the world, built by a mother for a drowned son. Washington has a memorial raised by American women to the men of the Titanic. There is no memorial anywhere to the private servants. Not in Southampton, not in New York, not in Philadelphia, not in Montreal. They are on the manifest and on the casualty rolls and in the pages of a research database that a few thousand people read. They are not on any stone. The Washington Memorial honors the men who gave their lives so that women and children might be saved, which is a fair description of Victor Giglio, of Edwin Keeping, and of John Farthing. It was not written with them in mind. Every one of the households in this account employed a man who died on that ship, and not one of them built anything for him. The Straus Memorial makes the point better than any argument could. It stands in a small park in Manhattan, near where their house was, and it carries a line from the Song of Solomon, saying that many waters cannot quench love, neither can the floods drown it. It is a beautiful thing, and it is not wrong. Isidor and Ida Straus did refuse to be parted, and they did die together. John Farthing also refused to leave that couple, and he also died, and he is not on it. 3 people from one household stayed on that deck. 2 of them are in a park in Manhattan, and 1 of them is nowhere. So the answer to what these households were buying is narrower than it looks, and it is not comfort and not display. It was closeness, and closeness had a price per crossing. £247, 10 and 6, to keep a maid down the corridor. £13 to store a cook 2 decks below. For 6 days that purchase looked like an indulgence. For about 2 hours and 40 minutes, it worked as a sorting mechanism for who would be alive at dawn. The women bought close lived. The men bought close died, beside the men who bought them. The people stored below died, without ever learning what was happening. Nobody designed that. There was no villain in the booking office and no cruelty in the schedule of fares. There was a household, priced and loaded onto a ship, and then an accident, and then the household's own logic running to completion in the dark with nobody steering it. What power built here was a household that reached into the most private corners of a family's life and hired people to live in those corners. What it cost on one night was 14 of those people, and the invoice was settled in 1916 for $664,000, which was less than 4 times what one surviving woman had asked for her clothes. It fell the way it had been built, from the top down along the corridors, in order of proximity, with the men who served standing where they had been trained to stand. There is one more thing the fare column bought, and it is the part that does not appear on any schedule. The households that paid for closeness were also buying the obligation that came with it. A man kept 20 paces from his employer for 6 days does not, at 1 in the morning, suddenly become a stranger who owes him nothing. The proximity was sold as convenience. It was received by the people on the other end of it as duty. Nobody wrote that clause into the ticket. It was in the work. So here are the ones who did not come back. Victor Robbins, valet to John Jacob Astor IV. Victor Gaitan Andrea Giglio, valet to Benjamin Guggenheim, aged 24. John Farthing, manservant to Isidor Straus, aged 48. Edwin Herbert Keeping, valet to George Widener, aged 33. Edwin Charles Wheeler, manservant to George Widener, 2nd class. George Swain, chauffeur to the Allisons, aged 19. Augustus Henry Aldworth, chauffeur to the Carters, aged 35. René Pernot, chauffeur to Benjamin Guggenheim, 2nd class. Richard Thomas Fry, Valet to Joseph Bruce Ismay. William Henry Harrison, secretary to Joseph Bruce Ismay. Vivian Ponsonby Payne, secretary to Charles Melville Hayes, age 22. Alexander Milne Cairns, Sante Regini. Henry Charles Harrington. Not one of them chose the ship. Of those 14, a small number were recovered from the sea in the weeks that followed. Most were not. Victor Giglio has no grave. John Farthing has no grave. René Pernod has no grave. They are among the 1,500 people for whom the wreck itself is the burial. 2.5 miles down on a plain of gray silt, where nothing decays quickly and nothing is marked. Edwin Keeping came home because a family paid for it. That remains the only difference between a name on a stone and a name on a list. And here are the ones who came back, without a single exception. Ellen Barber, Albina Bassani, Nellie Bassett, Rosalie Bidois, Ellen Bird, Grace Scott Bowen, Amelia Mary Brown, Elizabeth Margaret Burns, Victorine Chaudinson, Alice Catherine Cleaver, Sarah Daniels, Caroline Louise Andres, Margaret Fleming, Laura Mabel Francatelli, Amalie Henriette Giger, Rose Amélie Icard, Emily Croychin, Bertha Leroy, Eugenie Elise Lorette, Roberta Elizabeth Mary Maioni, Fermina Oliva Iocana, Mary Ann Perrot, Emma Saygesser, Augusta Jeanne Serapla, Elizabeth Weedshoots, Annie Moore Ward, Helen Alice Wilson. They went back to work. That last sentence deserves more than it usually gets, because going back to work meant going back to this: fastening, pressing, carrying, standing behind a chair while other people ate. Rosalie Bidois went back to it for the woman she had watched become a widow. Ellen Bird went back to it wearing, or not wearing, a dead woman's coat. Alice Cleaver went back to England and eventually out of service altogether, into a marriage and a house of her own, and lived another 7 decades with a story she would not tell. None of them was compensated for the night. None of them was asked about it officially. Most of them were never asked about it at all. The service door is still there in the houses that survive. At Biltmore, and at the Newport cottages, and in the English country houses that take visitors. The tour now goes downstairs as well as up, and the kitchens and the bellboards and the servants' stairs are pointed out as the interesting part. That is a recent development and a welcome one. It has not yet reached the 14, which returns this to 2 lines on a manifest. £13 against £247, 10 shillings and 6pence. At the start, those were 2 prices for the same 6 days at sea. They were not. One of them bought a bunk in a part of the ship with no stairway to the boats. The other bought a door 20 paces from an employer. On a corridor the officers reached first. Both women lived, and neither of them lived because of what she had paid or what she was worth. The mansions are museums now. The Widener estate is gone. The Astor money went out through 4 generations of trusts. And in the paperwork of a settlement filed in 1916, between an inventory of a pink diamond and a claim for a motor car, are 14 men who had been hired to carry other people's luggage and who stayed at their posts because that was, in the end, the job. The dynasty is dust. The service was the price.